All right. Thanks everybody for sticking around for the last session of the day. We've been building, block by block as with each session of the topics that we've covered. And this one is equally critical to discuss. We can fund and plan for all our aspirational goals, but if we can't get these things in the ground in the next 10 to 20 years, no pressure, we're really going to be in trouble. So today, we really want to talk about some of the other key issues that are driving our ability to get these things into the ground. Thank you, Will. Great. Yes, implementation pathway. So how do we get to scale on these things in the Bay Area? Some of the key issues are technical issues. We've heard a lot about that today. Also policy and regulatory support is a big key driver, as well as, the funding, the fiscal capacity, and incentivizing getting these things built. So, so why are we bringing these three folks together? All the work in this space with the goal, all of us work in this space with the goal to get greater wetland outcomes from our respective roles. And so we have Sahrye Cohen with the Environmental Protection Agency. Oh, sorry, I'm also with the Environmental Protection Agency, Region 9, the Wetlands and Ocean section, and Sahrye is my manager. She's an excellent manager, and that should get me a small raise. So she'll be speaking to the policy and regulatory perspective. Ellen Plain with the San Francisco Estuary Institute she's going to be bringing the applied science data perspective from her work. And then Heidi Nutters with the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. She brings that regional planning and facilitation for multi-beneficial projects. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sahrye.
Thanks, Jen. All right, so I'm going to start us off with talking about implementation pathways and planning drivers and kind of the regulatory context. So even though I came from more of a science, actually restoration project background, I've been spending mostly the last 15 years in the regulatory and policy environment. So why are we all here? And kind of why are we here from an EPA perspective? So nature-based solutions, much like protecting forests or other restoring coastal marshes, are a pillar of fighting the climate change crisis. So, it's not there are many pathways that we need to follow to get to a climate resilient and adaptive future, and this is one of them. So our nature-based solutions are the ways that we can sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges while simultaneously providing benefits for people and the environment. And so that's kind of EPA's mission, is protecting human health and the environment. And for me, the goal is not to restore this estuary, San Francisco Bay, to some past less disturbed era, but to recover and activate the natural processes to make the estuary healthy and resilient for the future. And so I'm asking you all to look at the problem holistically. We're not just looking at fill at the lower edges of the wetlands, but we're also looking to see what we can do in the upland areas and expanding out into areas that aren't already activated for ecosystems. So, and then the benefit of these projects is we're not just providing ecosystem benefits, but we're also providing flood resiliency and hazard mitigation. And so that's a benefit for economics and for people. So we're protecting communities. It's a wise economic choice, even when these projects cost a lot of money in the long term. And one of the examples is there was an analysis that was done after Superstorm Sandy that estimated that wetlands protected kind of Staten Island and the areas of New York for about $625 million worth of damage. So again, this is like a choice that we're making for not just ecosystem resiliency, but for hazard mitigation as well. All right. So from the federal perspective, like one of the drivers is for both the state and federal agencies is that our executives told us to do this. So, that's always an important thing, right? Somebody somebody with a fancier title needs to tell you to do something. So on Earth Day 2022, President Biden signed Executive Order 14072, which is strengthening the nation's forest communities and local economies. And as part of this, he said that we needed a report about the key opportunities for greater deployment of nature-based solutions. And that's all across the federal government, so all of the executive agencies. So this report has come out, and what it has is a roadmap with 5 strategic areas of change that are needed to kind of unleash the full potential. And so that from the federal side, it's really exciting to hear that on a national policy level, people want us to do these solutions. And then here in California, there's also an executive order, which is N8220, which elevates the role of natural and working lands in the fight against climate change and advancing biodiversity conservation. And so I think mostly people know about this by the 30 by 30 strategy. And so that also talks a lot about nature-based solutions and kind of implementation pathways and permitting that we can do. So I think there's currently the zeitgeist, there's a lot of support from kind of a top down about doing this as well. And I think that's always helpful for those of us who work for agencies because we have a mandate to do this. All right, and then the other big area is funding, right? Projects cost money. I think most of the folks here in this room know that. And so what we really need is we need money not just to do great infrastructure, but to do green infrastructure, to also work on these innovative ideas and projects. We just talked a little bit about needing to do kind of open-ended monitoring, right? All of those things cost money. So from the federal side, which is EPA is a giant money funnel. In case people don't know, we give out a lot of money in grants and in low interest loans. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is the bill, and the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, are making actually quite a large amount of investment in nature-based solutions. So $8.7 billion throughout the federal government will go towards nature-based solutions and other sorts of approaches to climate change. And then another 8.6 billion will go to restoring and conserving coastal habitats. So I think we have the opportunity right now with this money. And of course, it takes a while to get implementation in place, to get funding through these grants and loans, but that means that we'll be able to build these. And then there's a lot of federal resources for these nature-based solutions. Here at EPA, we have non-point source grants through the Section 319 program. That might be familiar to folks for who do Clean Water Act. The State Revolving Fund, which is low interest loans to California. We have a new San Francisco Bay geographic program. So if you've heard of like the Great Lakes program or the Chesapeake Bay program, we now have one in San Francisco Bay, which will be really great for our regional issues. And then there's the SFA Water Quality Improvement Fund. So that's the program that our watersheds group, like Louisa, works on. And then throughout the federal government, FEMA has pre-disaster mitigation grants. NOAA has a community-based restoration program, and US Fish and Wildlife has a coastal program. And these are all programs that can help with the funding for these nature-based solutions. All right, so I mentioned that there is now a federal strategic plan. There's a strategic roadmap, and it identified these 5 issues: updating policies, unlocking funding. So I just talked a little bit about funding, leading with federal facilities and assets. So I'm looking at our friends at the Corps. They have a lot of federal facilities and assets. Training the workforce, so both internally within the federal government, and then all of the work that we do in building community and workforce development through grants, and then prioritizing research, innovation, knowledge, and adaptive learning. And I think in particular, the sessions today and tomorrow are really talking a lot about this last one about prioritizing research, innovation, knowledge, and adaptive learning. And I want to talk here a little bit about the updating policies. So this strategic roadmap is telling our executive agencies like EPA that we need to update our policies and guidance to make it easier to consider and use nature-based solutions. And this includes everything like permitting process, agency review methods, for example, general permits and programmatic reviews, It's instructing us to really find these opportunities for efficient use of resources. And then it's also telling agencies that are funders or cost sharers to use their discretionary cost share to make these sorts of projects happen. So I really want to point this out because I think this is a huge opportunity. It's much harder for regulatory agencies to do something when they're swimming upstream, right? Ellen mentioned there's the fear of litigation, but there's also kind of just the boundaries that we have with 50 years of practice on the Clean Water Act. And so I think having this executive direction really helps us include these flexibilities in our programs. All right, and then just to talk about what is our regulatory context. So the Clean Water Act is more than 50 years old, and I think that it has really made a lot of progress in restoring the waters of the US to fishable, swimmable. We're still working our way towards getting there, but it's really doing a great job. Even the fact that we think of these areas as marshes and not swamps that we should just be filling in, I think is a major success of the Clean Water Act. But that being said, we have a complex regulatory environment, especially here in California, where we have done a fantastic job of protecting the ecosystems that we do have and the species that we do have. So I'm going to talk a lot about this from the Clean Water Act side, because that is what the Wetlands Ocean sections, we do Clean Water Act and we do Marine Protection Research Sanctuaries Act. So there's not a lot of guidance for how to maintain flexibility in this. And as several presenters have already said, the regs were not written for these sorts of projects. So what we want to do is make sure that we can tell the story, right? That nature-based solutions, when they're placed appropriately, can ensure that we have high functioning aquatic resources into the future, that we are building climate resiliency, that we are ensuring that we are restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And this means that we're going to have to tackle the presumption that that we have through 50 years of practice, right? That things progress stepwise through the usual review process. And so I think it's going to take all of us. This is not just a thing that regulators can fix. It's a thing that proponents and communities, that everybody needs to work together, because we really want to look at, like, what is the purpose of this project? Why are we doing it? Can we avoid, can we minimize? Let's not just jump straight to talking about compensatory mitigation on some of these restoration projects, even when they're multi-benefit. But how can we really talk about what is our need and the reason that we're doing this project and how it fits into our regulations? Right, so I want to talk a little bit more about that, because we've already started having these conversations both at the regional and national level. So Sahrye earlier, like, has been having this conversation for at least the last 5 years, which is great. Because I really think that we need to start thinking about how we're going to do this on a watershed and regional approach. And we are so fortunate here in the Bay Area that we have been talking about this for decades already. So we already, I think, in our minds in this estuary, have a good idea of what the watershed approach is. And that is how a lot of the Clean Water Act is structured. So we need to not just think about the lower edges of wetlands, but where we can provide upland space, right? Can we acquire land? Where can we flex the needs that we have in the Bay Area? And so how are we going to decide where we're going to site these projects? You know, it's based on scientific analysis. It's based on the regional benefits, which we have information on. Which projects are ready to go? So if we have this amount of funding, do we have projects that we have already picked out that we can target to go in the ground? Environmental justice. There are communities that have been underserved by ecosystem protection, by flood control protection, by planning for the future. And we need to take leadership from those communities and figure out where those projects are going to go based on that as well. And then community needs. What best addresses what residents care about. So I know it's harder to do multi-benefit projects than straight restoration sometimes, but really there are community needs that are coming from that. And I hope that inspires everybody to keep working on those. And then really, I'd like to talk about the short-term impacts versus long-term benefits. So this requires us to do a really honest look at the trade-offs of fill in existing wetlands and an openness to looking at an alternatives analysis. So EPA wrote the 404B1 guidelines back in the 80s. Some people in this room might have been part of that. And so we really did have a different paradigm, right? When we're looking at alternatives, it was really based on the alternative to fill. And so I'd like us all to consider expanding that when we're thinking about this to planning for climate resiliency and adaptation. Like there are reasons that we need environmental benefits and to really start looking at the net benefits of this project and looking at long-term sustainability for climate change resiliency. And then I think Ellen alluded to feasibility and risk. So I think a lot of regulatory agencies are naturally risk adverse. I know ours definitely is. We have an entire floor of attorneys though, so we're prepared and we're ready to, I guess, meet the challenge. But there is so much to know that it is sometimes really hard for us to make decisions, and we do have to make trade-offs. And the more information that we can have, the easier it is for us to justify taking that leap, adding in more risk to the project. And again, I know monitoring is expensive, but it's so critical, not only for us to know how projects work and adaptive management, for us to also take those lessons learned and apply them to other projects. So hopefully we can, with the amount of funding that's coming, we can start planning for that better. All right, so I really believe that this space is a yes and. It will take all of these projects and all of these programs. So kind of the list I have here of permitting collaboration and programmatic efficiencies, using technical tools, using an analytical approach to net benefits, adaptive management for project success, collaborative forums for lessons learned like this program here today. We will need all of these things to make these projects work. And so we're really going to have to talk about restoration projects demonstrating net benefits, even when they're multi-benefit, in order to help the permitters figure out where to place this in their universe of regulations. We'll have to use technical tools on watershed plans, technical tools. I'll talk a little bit about the aquatic resource type conversion framework, an analytical approach to net benefits that looks at what the benefits are to counterbalance, I guess, the fill for habitat and potential impact to species, adaptive management for project success so that regulators can take that risk, right? There's less uncertainty, or if there is uncertainty, we know how we're going to handle it. And then again, kind of a process of continual improvement. All right. And then just briefly want to talk a little bit about regional tools. So again, we have a lot of these technical tools that we can use to make decisions, right? The Estuary Blueprint is led by SFEP, and it talks about how do we sustain and protect estuary and all its beneficial uses. What are the actions that we should be taking to prepare for climate change to build a thriving estuary? And the blueprint actually has a list of actions in 32 different areas, right? So we know kind of in a regional context, what are those actions that we should be taking. The Adaptation Atlas, which is done by SFEI and the Aquatic Science Center, talks about the landscape and operational landscape units, which are a practical way to manage the physical and jurisdictional complexity of the base shoreline. And that really does identify where to use natural and nature-based approaches. So we already have a lot of information about where we can implement these projects. And I think that will really help us in taking advantage of the funding that's coming. And then Bay Adapt, which is a regional strategy for rising tides, I guess, that's convened by BCDC. And its goal is to establish regional agreement on actions to protect people and the natural and built environment of San Francisco Bay. So again, this goes really well with the watershed approach in the Clean Water Act and the way that some of the other state and federal regulations are structured. So we have these essentially regional planning tools that we know where these projects can be sited. And then we also have technical tools. So the aquatic resource type conversion framework really came out of a need that permitters and practitioners from EPA, the Corps, the water boards, Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMFs, CDFW, where we would have these discussions where project proponents would say, we want to take what is now seasonal marshes or farmed wetlands or salt ponds, and we want to open that up to tidal action because we know from our regional planning that it's really important. And a lot of regulatory agencies were like, okay, we understand that, but we don't have a really great way to methodically go through that process and document how those changes are going to be made and what are the benefits. So EPA supported this development of this tool in collaboration with the other agencies. And it really takes data and information about specific sites to help regulators make these decisions. So we can develop these technical tools. There's so much intense scientific and practitioner knowledge in the Bay Area that when we do run into these challenges about how to do the actual implementation, we can develop technical tools to make that happen. And then I want to emphasize the idea of pilot projects. So I know we have 100,000 acres to restore, but when we're trying innovative things that maybe haven't been tried in our environment or haven't been tried at all, I think there's a lot of openness to the idea of pilot projects, where we say that we have a lot of uncertainty. We're not entirely sure what's going to happen, but this is our plan to manage that and to take those lessons learned and then apply them to larger projects. I also say that we can take information from other parts of the country, other states, other regions, other parts of the world, where people have tried these approaches and see what analogs exist to our area. So again, I want to encourage these pilot projects. We're really seeing them being effective for sediment management throughout the Bay, for LTMS, for those sorts of projects. So it's a really great tool that we can use. All right. And then talking more specifically about permitting collaboration and programmatic efficiency. So again, this is not the only path forward. We need regulatory enthusiasm, participation. Things might need legislative changes. We might need to just throw a whole lot of money at things as well. So we need all these things, but here in my world, this is the only part that I can really directly control any little bit of it. So I want to talk about that. So the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team is a group of 6 agencies that write permits on this type of work. And the idea is improved permit efficiency. So the key to success is close coordination with applicants. So early and often, close collaboration between BRIT members to try as much as possible to integrate our various regulations. Again, everybody has their own mandate. There's not much we can change that on an individual regional level. Having a dedicated group of managers to work out policy issues. We assign ourselves policy work. We also try to work out disagreements between the agencies on actual project-specific work, and then dedicated funding. And that's really where some of the partners who are doing projects and also the State Coastal Conservancy has really helped, is to be able to dedicate people's staff time to work through these. And then, we've had a lot of lessons learned, and we've been really talking to other kinds of collaborative permitting groups to talk about the challenges that we've had working together, where we can work through some of that friction and what recommendations might be for other groups and for us to progress in the future. And so there are other groups that are also working on this. California's Cutting the Green Tape Initiative, which is a statewide regulatory compliance pathway for restoration projects. And so the idea is to increase the pace and scale of environmental restoration. And basically Cutting the Green Tape has started doing this through statutory exemptions, restoration management permits, and efficiencies in CEQA, the California Endangered Species Act, and consistency determination. So again, it's a It's another way to try to do permitting efficiencies, and not everything fits into the Cutting the Green Tape initiative. So there are still projects that are going to go outside of it that will need that close coordination and a group of dedicated regulators to work on projects together. But one of the things that they have done is also pair this up with programmatic water quality orders and biological opinions. So both some of the BRIT projects and some of the Cutting the Green Tape are able to use these programmatic efforts. And these are programmatic efforts that the State Water Board did for 401 and Porter Cologne permitting, and then also for Endangered Species Act permitting as well. So again, it takes a constellation of efforts. I don't think that we have found the one true way. And I really do think it's a yes and we need to do all of these. All right, so one of the phrases I really liked in this strategic roadmap for nature-based solutions, the federal effort, was the opportunity to accelerate. I like the idea that this is a challenge and that we can meet it. It's not an issue for any one group to be able to solve on their own. It's going to take all of us, policymakers, proponents, the community, regulators, traditional practitioners, all of us. And Louisa had a really good comment that she said, our goal is that in 5 years, we aren't still having the same conversations. And I think that that is really key, that we found solutions to some of the conversations that we're having today and the conversations that we had 5 years ago. So I would really appreciate everyone joining me and being solution oriented. It is going to take time and money and effort if you're at the vanguard of this. So, make progress against that. And we're going to need to have a solution oriented mindset at all levels of our organizations. Pass it on.
Right. Ellen, you're up next.
Great. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be talking today, building on some of what Sahrye was talking about how we need to have regional data sets, regional tools that can help us identify key opportunities that we should be pursuing to make progress within this short time frame that we need to do so. So I'll go ahead and get started by building on some of the work that's been mentioned a couple times today in SFEI's Adaptation Atlas that was published back in 2019. So two of the key nature-based solutions that were mapped in the Adaptation Atlas were ecotone levees and marsh migration space. And so SFEI is currently engaged in some work to expand beyond what was done in the Adaptation Atlas. So really what was done in the Atlas was suitability mapping. So looking at opportunities across the Bay where the physical conditions are applicable and suitable for these various types of nature-based solutions. And so in the case of ecotone levees, we were looking at areas between tidal marshes and developed areas, places where a narrow band of ecotone, as we've been hearing about today, could provide some of these transition zone benefits. However, we know that these maps that were in the Atlas are really just meant to be ideas. Is a wide swath of places where this could be done, doesn't necessarily identify places where all of these should be done. And it definitely isn't meant to be a plan. And so really what we're trying to do now is build beyond what's in the Atlas to figure out what are some of the elements of resilience of the shoreline that we really can map and identify places where doing these actions will actually increase the resilience of the shoreline. So this is showing some of the maps of the ecotone levees from the Atlas, the opportunity maps. We also looked at opportunities for marsh migration space. So this is areas that are above the tidal range now, but will be within the tidal range in the future. And so these maps were based on a 2-meter sea level rise scenario, looking at places essentially that are undeveloped, that are within that elevation band above today's tidal marshes. And as you can see in the maps here, those areas are fairly limited. We've been hearing a lot today about how much development has gone on in the transition zone over the last 100 years or so, and how limited the opportunities are. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to be thinking about protecting these areas. So in terms of getting to implementation, the topic of our session today, so the Atlas identified 224 ecotone levee opportunities in over 15,000 acres of possible migration space. But now we're really thinking about how can we build on that mapping? Where can these projects actually be implemented, and where will they have the most impact if we do implement them there? And so I'll be talking about two different efforts that we've been working on recently. So the first is thinking about linking that ecotone levee mapping to think about horizontal levees that incorporate seepage slopes that help polish wastewater and remove nutrients, in addition to thinking about some of those transition zone habitat benefits that we've been talking about. And then secondly, I'll be talking about some work that we're currently doing mapping the connectivity of the transition zones to marshes and diked baylands. So moving beyond that simple map of the locations to think more about the connectivity aspect. So first, starting out talking about horizontal levee implementation opportunities. So the Regional Water Quality Control Board's second nutrient watershed permit required that the wastewater dischargers to the bay explore various ways that they may be able to reduce their nutrient loads that are discharged to the bay. And so there are various mechanisms for doing so. One of the ways to do that is through nature-based solutions like open water treatment wetlands and horizontal levees, including the Orelloma horizontal levee and Palo Alto, other things that Heidi will be touching on more in her talk today. And so through this effort with BACWA, we were able to expand some of the mapping that was done in the Adaptation Atlas, thinking about ecotone levee opportunity mapping, updating some of that work, as well as identifying locations for ecotone levees that are near wastewater treatment plants and could be used as horizontal levee opportunities that do incorporate that subsurface seepage slope that can help with reducing nutrient loads that are discharged to the bay. And so on the right of the slide here, you're seeing some of the mapping for the South Bay area, identifying places where horizontal levee opportunities may be able to be pursued. Through this work, we were able to connect with a lot of the dischargers around the bay and discuss some of these opportunities for implementing horizontal levees, and that's an ongoing process. I want to talk a little bit about choosing where to use the limited resources. Steve's talk and many others today talked about the challenges of using fill material, how limited it is and how expensive it is. And that certainly is something that came up in our conversations with many of the wastewater treatment agencies as we were going around the bay discussing these opportunities. The cost and limitations of building horizontal levees are too high to even consider in many places. And so it is requiring us to be creative and think about where really are the best opportunities to do that and where can we use other methods that may be more appropriate in the landscape and more feasible given those constraints. And so I just want to point out an example of some of our work with Fairfield Sassoon Sewer District. So they're interested in implementing some nature-based solutions for a variety of purposes, including nutrient removal, as well as access to recreational opportunities for the local area, as well as improving wildlife habitat. And so we've been exploring the concept with them of using treated wastewater as a resource, in this case, to create treatment wetlands that would build up organic material. So they're peat building wetlands, and they would be built in areas that are currently quite low lying surrounding the plant. They're separated from Sassoon Marsh at this point by dikes that could be breached in the future with sea level rise. Of course, that planning is a long way away at this point, but we know that increasing the elevations of that land around the plant has a variety of benefits. If that area is eventually, or when it's eventually reconnected to tidal action, it will be at a higher elevation due to this peat building process, resulting in more longevity and resilience of that wetland to sea level rise in the future. At the same time, these treatment wetlands, including vegetated peat building wetlands, can also be a good way of reducing nutrient loads. And so there's a lot of benefits to explore. And this is something that we are planning to explore in a pilot project at Fairfield Sassoon Sewer District, building on some lessons learned from subsidence reversal wetlands in the Delta at Sherman Island and Twitchell Island. And we hope that the lessons learned from that Fairfield pilot can be expanded more broadly around the bay, thinking about how we can use wastewater and stormwater as a resource to build up elevations prior to tidal reconnection of some of these areas. So I've talked a bit now about the horizontal levee opportunities around the bay. Now I want to switch over to talking about improving connectivity to natural transition zones. showing a photo here of Hoffman Marsh, like many other areas around the bay where there's not really an opportunity to improve connectivity to natural transition zones due to the heavily developed area and infrastructure behind the marsh. But for the areas where that's not the case, we do have a really valuable opportunity to protect and connect marshes to transition zones. So we're currently engaged in an effort called the Shoreline Resilience Framework. And really what we're trying to do is define shoreline resilience and map it. And we really hope that this will provide a regional resource for all of us in this room, on the Zoom and beyond, to aid in adaptation and restoration decision-making at the regional scale. And that we can continue to use some of the metrics that we're developing over time to really track how our adaptation actions are or are not actually improving the resilience of the shoreline. And I do want to acknowledge some of our partners on this work listed on the slide, including the WRMP, the Regional Board, the Army Corps San Francisco District, Google, and others. So the approach that we're taking to mapping shoreline resilience is to think about it in the lens of ecosystem services. So a lot of what we've been talking about today are thinking about, why do we want to increase the resilience of the shoreline? As Stuart was talking about, one of those things that we do want to make sure to do is preserve those ecosystem services that are provided by our marshes, mudflats, and the baylands. And so that's the framing that we've chosen to take with this work. And we're tackling these ecosystem services sort of one at a time. We started out with creating a shoreline resilience framework for wildlife support that outlines a number of elements of shoreline resilience that can pertain to that ecosystem service. And now we're moving on to thinking about flood attenuation and hope to tackle many of these other ecosystem services as well. So the elements of shoreline resilience for wildlife support that we identified are listed here. And this is building on some earlier work completed in 2015 by SFEI on a document called the Landscape Resilience Framework. And we really took and adapted that work more specifically to the San Francisco Baylands. And so I'm listing out a number of the elements here. We're currently engaged in developing metrics that tackle mapping each of these elements. However, given the limited time I have today, I'm not going to go through the wide range of metrics that we're developing. I do want to mention a couple of them that I won't talk about today that fit into the topographic complexity that includes high tide refuge within the marsh, which has come up a number of times today. So I do want to note that we are developing a regional map of that, as well as redundancy. So thinking about marshes that have both high tide refuge within the marsh, in addition to connected transition zone at the back of the marsh. That's something else that we're looking at. But today I'm really going to be focusing on talking about number one, that connectivity within the complete marsh. So here's this image from the Baylands Goals report. Many of you are very familiar with thinking about the complete marsh concept, which has already been described today. We're really building on that complete marsh concept and identifying elements that we can actually map to determine which marshes can be considered complete marshes, which marshes have different elements of that connectivity from the subtidal all the way to the uplands. And so today I'm focusing on number one listed here, the connectivity to the upland transition zone. So we're using three different data sources for the maps of transition zone around the bay. Each of these is kind of tackling, identifying the transition zone from a different angle, and thus provides sort of a complementary set of information. So the Bay Margin Transition Zone that was led by Brian Fulfrost is based on tidal elevation modeling, and it does a really good job at identifying existing transition zone habitat around the bay. The second data set we're using is the marsh migration space from the Adaptation Atlas that I showed you earlier. As I mentioned, that one's based on sea level rise projections, and it also includes information from satellite imagery, so it's only looking at undeveloped areas within that sea level rise band. And that one really is best for identifying areas for future marsh migration. And then finally, we've created a new data set using the upper boundary transition zone method, the first piloted in Southern California by April Robinson and others. So this is new mapping that we're creating for the Bay at this point. And this is the broadest definition of transition zone. And so we know there's a lot of services that are provided by the transition zone that happen outside that narrower band of migration space. So there's benefits that occur in essential services for wildlife within a lateral band that extends much farther inland, regardless of the elevation of the shoreline. And so this is more of a lateral method, looking at a buffer of 500 meters inland from the back of the marsh. And again, we're removing developed areas from that consideration. So I'll show some early results here. We're still in the process of refining some of this mapping, but I wanted to share some of it with you today. So the way that we're choosing to map these marsh resilience metrics is at the scale of the individual marsh or the individual diked bayland. And so we're looking at one of those marshes here now. This is up in Sassoon Bay near Belden's Landing. And this is an example of a marsh that has very good transition zone connectivity. And so you can see how the maps compare across the 3 different types of transition zone that we're looking at. On the left is the bay margin approach. That's best for mapping the existing transition zone. The middle is migration space, that elevation-based layer. And on the right is the upper boundary. That's that most expansive lateral definition of transition zone. And you can see that this marsh, having a fairly undeveloped shoreline, performs well according to all 3 of the metrics. Now I'm showing an area that has less good transition zone connectivity, at least according to 2 out of the 3 metrics. So this is Strawberry Cove in Mill Valley. And so we can see on the left side here, there is some pretty good connectivity to existing transition zone, at least a very narrow band of it around the edge of the marsh. And then the right 2, you can see there's almost no connectivity at all to migration space or upper boundary transition zone at this unit. And so this is giving us sort of a way of comparing at a regional scale. We know none of these metrics are going to be perfect because we're trying to map them using existing GIS data across the whole region. And so we're hoping to be continually expanding, improving, refining some of these metrics. But we do aim to provide some useful data that can help, at least with relative comparisons across the bay. One way that we anticipate this mapping being useful is in identifying important areas for complete marsh restoration sites. And so here we're looking across the North Bay. The diked baylands are shown in gray, existing marshes shown in green. I know there's some issues in the underlying data set here that we're still working out. We're basing all of our research here on the Baylands Change Base Map that's under development at the moment, targeted to be completed later this year. And looking at these maps can really help us identify places where there is connected migration space or transition zone at the back of a diked bayland. And so restoring that particular location may be really valuable in terms of creating a more resilient restoration that has space to migrate over time into natural transition zones. As Peter was alluding to at Sears Point and others, you know, a lot of the sites that we've been able to restore that so far, we've had to go to a lot of effort to create these artificial transition zones, where in places, if we're able to connect back into that naturally rising ground, those marshes can be a lot more resilient over time. And so really what we're adding with this data set is a look at that connectivity between the back of the marsh and the transition zone. So in the past, we've had these colored blobs at the back of the marsh, but it's not been clear whether there's a levee interrupting that connectivity, how much of the marsh could actually be connected if it was restored. And so we're developing some quantitative metrics now that are targeted on that connectivity element to help get at some of those restoration decision processes. So we hope to use these results in a variety of ways to help improve shoreline resilience. We're currently working with Julie and the Army Corps on the Regional Dredge Material Management Plan. And these metrics are going to help them provide some quantitative justification for federal cost share for beneficial reuse projects. And so that's one early application of this work that we hope will be useful. And we also hope to help them identify future priority sites for sediment placement projects based on these metrics and their relative values around the bay. Some of this work will also feed directly into the development of Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program indicators. There's going to be a talk by my colleague Caitlin Crane tomorrow that will touch on that. And then we also want to continue to, as I mentioned, expand this analysis in response to regional needs. So we want to make this as useful as possible, as targeted to aid in implementation. And so some recent feedback that we've been hearing is that it would be really useful to think about some of these metrics in the context of an OLU, the contribution at a landscape scale. And so that's a direction that we're planning to head And I'm certainly interested to talk to any of you who have ideas about how we can apply this, make it more useful. We certainly want to hear that and incorporate that into our future work. And then my last point here is that we hope to, in the future, build some of these metrics into an online decision support tool that will help get at both identifying and comparing the resilience of the existing shoreline, as well as thinking about the benefits of pursuing some of these projects, the multiple benefits that Sahrye was talking about. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and thank you all for listening. Looking forward to your questions at the end of the panel.
Hi, everybody. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SFEP's work on advancing nature-based solutions. I'm going to touch on a couple of individual pilot projects that we've worked with several folks in the room with. So I'm excited to see everybody that's here. I just want to say hi. There's like 70 people on Zoom watching as well. So it's great to see the hybrid participation. So Sahrye really spoke to this, so I don't think I need to go into it anymore, except just to say that, you know, we're in an interesting time in the region right now where we're seeing these drivers of towards more projects, getting to scale, more projects in the ground, both at the regional, state, and federal level. You talked about the federal executive order, and kind of some really significant challenges in getting there. And I appreciated the positive framing of how we do that together. So we've got a glut of projects that we're trying to advance because of these drivers of urgency that we're seeing, a lot of unlocked funding, a lot more methods of engaging communities and tribes that are really unlocking different ways of looking at multi-benefit projects. And so we need to do that you know, all together, as you said. So SFEP's work is really driven by the Estuary Blueprint, our regional framework for advancing the health of the estuary. At the regional scale, we work on technology transfer and convening as we work on things like this workshop. We have others that I'll mention further in my presentation. We've been working on analysis, looking at addressing barriers to implementation, funding, regulatory, governance, and advancing on the ground projects. So I'll speak a little bit to that as well. So this is a map of some of SFEP's on the ground projects. This doesn't really touch on our OLU scale planning, which we're doing in a few different communities as well. Ellen mentioned the Fairfield-Sassoon Sewer District project. We're also working on the North Richmond Living Levee and several others that are listed here and a couple that I will touch on. So part of how we're trying to get to scale is just by understanding the problem at different scales and trying to advance them. So some of you have heard about the Oraloma Horizontal Levee project, and it's been mentioned earlier today. This is a great example of a pilot project that was built. It's a living laboratory. I highly encourage you to go out to the site if you are interested in bringing your staff out, come talk to me because we are happy to help facilitate that. So this was built to study water quality improvement opportunities. And I just want to add my own framing of, we use different terms for an ecotone levee, a horizontal levee. My perspective on it is a horizontal levee is an ecotone levee that incorporates treated wastewater, either for irrigation or for polishing or for some kind of treatment method. We're partnering with UC Berkeley, Valley Water, all of the partners listed here. Save the Bay did the planting. I do want to mention that they saw incredible establishment of the plants at Oraloma because of the use of treated wastewater. So it's a great method just for habitat establishment at these sites. And we're continuing to monitor there. So we started by looking at nutrient removal at the site, and we've seen incredible results. There's several peer-reviewed studies that are listed on our website about that. We're also right now utilizing, we're looking at the use of reverse osmosis concentrate through these types of systems. We've just begun studying PFAS removal as well. And we're also beginning to look at things like metals and other kinds of emerging contaminants of emerging concern. So just a plug for pilot projects and what they can do for the region to help us advance our understanding of these projects. This is a visual that Angela Stiegler put together. She was a postdoc right now with EPA water reuse. She came out of David Sedlak's lab at UC Berkeley that really highlights, you know, what a conventional levee can do for us. And in this instance, this visual is showing, a seawall, with a wastewater treatment plant behind it, and sort of a traditional gray infrastructure approach. And as we're seeing increasing complexity of issues on our shoreline, this is a one problem, one solution approach. The horizontal levee on our left is that multi-benefit solution that has been talked about so much today. And this is not one size fits all. These look different in different places and different communities. So in this case, it's highlighting the incorporation of an existing levee with native vegetation and a water treatment layer. But I also wanted to uplift what I heard Juliana say earlier, because the benefits we can provide for this don't stop at the footprint of the project itself. They can also include public art, land acknowledgements, gathering spaces, and other amenities that communities might be asking for. So we're also beginning to look at that as well. So another project I wanted to mention is the Palo Alto horizontal levee. So this project, Ravenswood, was mentioned earlier today. This is just a little bit farther south near Bixby Park, if you know where that is. And SFEP has been working with the city of Palo Alto on this project since 2018. That's how long it's taken to get to almost construction on the project. And it's a multi-benefit project. So what we're trying to do is improve habitat to adapt to sea level rise. The Safer Bay project was mentioned. So this is aligning with that project, maintain public access. We've done extensive community engagement with this project, and as well as providing this sort of policy treatment of discharge treated wastewater. So as far as I know, this will be the first project built on our shoreline that's directly discharging treated wastewater into our bay from the project itself, since Oraloma is a closed loop system. And so that's an exciting accomplishment for the region. So some highlights about this, as I mentioned, it's the first horizontal levee that will be built with that wastewater conveyance. It implements several of our estuary blueprint tasks. It's an innovative design. We've talked a lot about permitting, and a lot of those new permitting approaches, those permitting tools have been tested out in this project. So we went through the BRIT process. We've utilized, and I'm looking at Jill Sunahara because, and Mark Lindley back there, because ESA have been so instrumental in all of this. We utilized the Cutting the Green Tape initiative, a programmatic biological opinion, and several NPDES permitting pathway with the water board. And so really this has been a proving ground for some of the ways that interagency coordination through the permitting process can look. And huge thanks to the BRIT. I see some BRIT reps in the room for your amazing work on this. And it paves the way for future projects as well. We really had to stitch together. We're very scrappy with how we were able to fund this through multiple funding sources. And as I mentioned, it's expected to start construction next year, July 2024. I'll also just mention that this is a unique partnership because SFEP is going to be managing construction on the project. So many of you who are working out in communities know that cities and counties have lost a lot of staff during COVID, and just the directive for them to uplift these very complex projects is huge when they're just trying to get their basic work done. And so we've partnered with the city and have managed the contracting through the entire scope of the project, including construction management. We'll be doing all of that in-house. So if you've ever done that, please come talk to me because I have a lot to learn. Okay, great. So some implementation challenges that I wanted to highlight, and I've touched on a few, is again, how do we do this at the scale that we need and at the pace that we need? The regulatory challenges are significant, and I'm just going to touch on that in our next slide. Governance is also a really huge issue. as we start to look more holistically at the shoreline, why those different agencies are at the table, what's driving them to be at the table, it's very different. And that might mean if we're going to advance a project, that one entity's priorities are put ahead of another. You know, so how do we use OLU scale planning, joint powers authority, MOUs, other kinds of methodologies to think about this multi-objective planning across jurisdictions and across, you know, land use and zoning types. When it gets down to the ground, I always joke that these projects are everyone's favorite thing except the people who have to build them, because it's a huge risk and it's a huge ask for the people that are you know, left to maintain them over time. And then keeping communities at the center. I think for me, I've noticed that these projects, they're very technical, and we have to be really excellent translators of the core objectives of these projects when we're going out to communities and constantly doing that dance between these really in the weed conversations about the technical design components and the larger objectives that the communities might be there to talk to us about. The Transforming Shorelines Collaborative is a group that we have that meets 3 to 4 times a year. Anyone is welcome to join. You can find it on our website. Come ask me if you'd like the link. And we talk a lot about these types of projects. We use an expert consultation model to really go into some of these nitty-gritty details. And we've also used it to deep dive into specific techniques, treatment wetlands, the use of reverse osmosis concentrate, that sort of thing. And we also have this project called Regulatory Pathways for Nature-Based Solutions. I work with Sahrye and Jen and Jill on that, where you have a white paper that's coming out that will be highlighting some of the key opportunities and challenges for our region. As we've talked about, regulatory agencies are adapting towards these innovative project types. And that includes a lot of rapid change that they're being asked to make in terms of new permitting tools, programmatic approaches, more interagency coordination, and you know, technical information. But these challenges still exist. You know, the regulatory pieces that they're having to coordinate are not always consistent. They don't always align well. And so, you know, how do we address those challenges? As people have mentioned, these regulations were not written for our realities today, and we know that further actions will be needed. So I have already mentioned, we really are interested in looking at OLU scale approaches or sub-regional approaches to permitting, really thinking about holistic benefits and trade-offs so that we're not having these skipping straight to these mitigation conversations on the shoreline, but instead looking holistically at the benefits and the long-term benefits for these projects. So this white paper should be coming out soon, and we're developing an action roadmap that will be coming out of that as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I'm going to hand it back to Jen for questions.